Welcome to Trend Reddit, where I share interesting, useful, and inspiring content. Let's explore the world together with the videos I create. As the evening sun slowly sets on the horizon, a wealthy millionaire stands by his son's grave, filled with pain and loss. Time passes, but his sorrow remains unresolved. One day, while sitting in despair by the grave, he unexpectedly sees a young man quietly kneeling, tears welling in his eyes. Unable to believe his eyes, he can't help but wonder, who is this person? Why is he here, in a place he thought was only for him and his painful memories? What awaits them ahead? Let's uncover the surprising and moving secrets that unfold in this fateful meeting. Don't forget to hit the follow button so you won't miss any new content. Thank you for stopping by, and I hope we'll have wonderful experiences together. Richard Cole stood alone in the quiet cemetery, the weight of grief hanging heavily on his shoulders as he stared at the small gravestone in front of him. It had been 2 years since his son, Jake, had died in a car accident, a tragic and sudden loss that had shattered the carefully constructed world Richard had built. He had always been a man in control of his business, his wealth, his life. But the death of his only son was something he couldn't control, something he couldn't fix. Now, these solitary visits to Jake's grave were the only way he could maintain a connection to him. Jake had been Richard's pride and, at the same time, his greatest disappointment. They had been close once, but life had driven a wedge between them. As the years passed, they grew distant, their relationship strained by misunderstandings, expectations, and unspoken frustrations. Richard often wondered if things could have been different, if he had been a better father, more understanding, more open. But it was too late for those thoughts now. Jake was gone, and all Richard had left were memories and regrets. The soft rustling of leaves caught his attention. Glancing up, he saw a young man standing a few rows away, head bowed in prayer, his hands resting on Jake's gravestone. Richard's initial reaction was irritation. This was his moment, his private grief. He didn't need a stranger intruding on it. He stepped forward, his presence towering over the young man. "Who are you?" Richard's voice came out sharp, cutting through the stillness of the cemetery. The young man looked up, startled but calm. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude," he said softly, his eyes briefly meeting Richard's before glancing away. "I knew Jake. We were close." The words hit Richard like a punch. This boy knew Jake? He had never seen him before, never heard Jake mention him. "Close," he repeated, his voice laced with skepticism. The young man nodded, his expression guarded now. "Yeah, we were connected." Before Richard could press further, the young man stepped back, nodding politely. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly before turning and walking away, leaving Richard standing by Jake's grave, disturbed and unsettled by the encounter. As he watched the young man disappear into the distance, Richard felt a gnawing sense of curiosity and frustration. Who was this boy? And how did he know Jake? These questions began to burrow into Richard's mind, refusing to leave him alone. It had been 2 years since Jake's death, but now, for the first time in a long while, Richard felt something stir within him, a need for answers. The encounter with the young man lingered in Richard's mind, gnawing at him in a way he couldn't shake. He tried to dismiss it, telling himself that the boy was probably some distant acquaintance, someone who had crossed paths with Jake briefly. But the more Richard thought about it, the more he felt an inexplicable pull toward uncovering the truth. There was something about the way the boy had spoken, the way he had referred to being connected to Jake, that unsettled him deeply. Days turned into nights, and Richard found himself unable to focus on anything else. His business meetings, once the cornerstone of his life, felt distant and meaningless. Even the mansion that had once symbolized his success seemed cold and empty. His thoughts kept drifting back to the cemetery, to that young man. Who was he? Why had Jake never mentioned him? The questions began to consume him, and Richard knew he wouldn't find peace until he had answers. Driven by this strange obsession, Richard decided to dig into Jake's past. He had the means to do it. Years of building connections, wealth, and power had given him access to resources most people couldn't even dream of. He began making phone calls, reaching out to old friends of Jake's, business associates, anyone who might have information about the mysterious young man. When that didn't yield much, he hired a private investigator to track down anything related to Jake's last few years. It wasn't long before the investigator returned with shocking news. The young man's name was Evan, and he wasn't just some acquaintance of Jake's, he was Jake's son. Richard's grandson. The revelation hit Richard like a tidal wave. Jake had been in a relationship with a woman named Lisa Daniels, a woman Richard had never heard of, someone from a lower-class background that Jake had evidently kept secret. The more Richard uncovered, the more guilt and disbelief weighed on him. How had he not known? How had Jake hidden such an important part of his life from him? And why had Lisa never reached out after Jake's death? As these questions swirled in his mind, Richard felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He had failed Jake as a father, and now he was on the verge of failing his grandson too. Overwhelmed by the truth and the guilt that weighed heavily on his heart, Richard knew he couldn't let things stay as they were. He had to find Evan, to understand more about him, and maybe, in some way, make amends for the failures he had made with Jake. He had been blind to Jake's struggles, oblivious to the life he had built away from him, but he wouldn't repeat that mistake with his grandson. Determined, Richard tracked down Evan and his mother, Lisa. It wasn't hard. Lisa had stayed in the same modest home in a rough neighborhood for years. It was a place far removed from the life Richard and Jake had known, full of luxury and status. As he drove through the streets, Richard couldn't help but feel a sharp contrast between the world he had always known and the one Lisa and Evan had lived in. When he finally arrived at their small, weathered house, Richard hesitated for a moment. His stomach twisted with nerves, a sensation he wasn't accustomed to. He had spent decades commanding rooms, closing deals, and making powerful decisions, yet here, in front of this small, unassuming house, he felt unsure of himself. Still, he knew he had to face this. He knocked on the door, and after a few moments, it opened. Lisa stood there, her eyes narrowing as soon as she recognized him. Her expression was cold, defensive. "What do you want?" she asked sharply, not bothering with pleasantries. Richard swallowed, trying to find the right words. "I came to meet Evan." I didn't know," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of his confession. "I didn't know about him." Lisa crossed her arms, her gaze hard. "Jake never told you because he knew you wouldn't want to know. You always cared more about your business, your money, and your image than your family." Her words stung, but Richard couldn't deny them. He had always been distant, more focused on building his empire than being there for Jake. "I'm not here to make excuses," Richard said quietly. "I just want a chance to meet my grandson." Lisa hesitated, her eyes searching Richard's face for sincerity. Finally, she stepped aside, though the tension between them remained thick. Richard stepped into the modest home, realizing just how much he had missed, how much of Jake's life, and now Evan's, had slipped through his fingers. Evan was not what Richard expected. The boy was sharp, cautious, and clearly skeptical of Richard's sudden interest in his life. When they finally met, the tension in the room was palpable. Evan stood tall, arms crossed, his expression guarded. It was clear that he wasn't going to welcome Richard with open arms. "So, you're my grandfather," Evan said flatly, his tone betraying his mistrust. "Why are you here now?" Richard, unaccustomed to being questioned in such a direct manner, struggled to find the right words. "I didn't know about you, Evan," he admitted, his voice filled with regret. "I didn't know about your mother, or the life Jake had outside of everything else. If I had, I would have." "Would have what?" Evan cut him off, his eyes narrowing. "Done something? Been there for us? For him? You weren't there for Jake, so why should I believe you would have been there for me?" Richard felt the sting of the words. He had failed Jake in many ways, and now that failure was being laid bare in front of him through Evan's raw emotions. "You're right," Richard said after a long pause. "I wasn't the father Jake needed. I know that now. But I'm trying to make things right, in whatever way I can. I don't want to just throw money at this, I want to be part of your life, if you'll let me. Evan's skepticism was clear. Money? You think this is about money? He asked, his tone incredulous. You think that's what I need from you? No, Richard responded quickly. I'm not offering that. I'm offering my time, my support. I just want to get to know you, and maybe help, if you'll let me. Evan's lips tightened. Look, I've lived my whole life without you, without knowing you existed. And now you show up, expecting me to believe you care? Richard felt the weight of the boy's distrust. Evan had every reason to be wary, and Richard realized that repairing this fractured relationship would be harder than he anticipated. I can't change the past, Richard said quietly. But I'm here now. I want to help, not with money, but by being here, if you'll give me the chance. Evan didn't respond right away. He just stared at Richard, weighing his words, his intentions. Finally, after a long silence, he nodded slowly. We'll see, he muttered, clearly still unsure. The door was open, but only a crack, and Richard knew it would take time and patience to earn his grandson's trust. The tension between Richard and Evan continued to simmer as the days passed. Though Richard tried to show his sincerity, Evan remained guarded, suspicious of his every move. It all came to a head one afternoon when Richard brought a box of tools to the house, hoping they could work on some repairs together. He saw it as an opportunity to bond, to do something practical that might help bridge the gap between them. Evan, however, wasn't having it. What's this supposed to be? Evan asked, eyeing the tools with disdain. You think you can fix things around here and everything will be okay between us? Richard paused, the weight of the moment hanging heavy in the air. I'm not trying to fix everything in one day, he said carefully. I just thought we could spend some time together, do something useful. Evan crossed his arms, his face hardening. You think fixing a fence or hammering a few nails will make up for years of ignoring us? For not even knowing I existed? Richard looked at him, the guilt he had been carrying for months now flooding back. I didn't know about you, Evan. If I had known. But you didn't. Evan interrupted, his voice rising with anger. You didn't know, and that's the problem. You were too busy with your life, your money, your business. You didn't care enough to find out. And now you think you can just waltz in here and make everything right? Richard's chest tightened. This was the confrontation he had been dreading but knew was inevitable. I made mistakes with Jake, he said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. I wasn't there for him the way I should have been. But I'm here now, and I want to be there for you. I can't change the past, but I'm trying to do better. Evan scoffed, his frustration clear. Do better? You can't just show up and expect me to forget everything. It doesn't work that way. Richard stepped closer, his eyes filled with sincerity. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I just want a chance. A chance to be a part of your life, to do things differently than I did with Jake. I've lost too much already, Evan. I don't want to lose you too. The air between them was thick with emotion. Evan stared at Richard, his defenses wavering. He didn't fully trust him yet, but for the first time, he saw something in Richard's eyes that wasn't there before, genuine remorse, a desire to make amends. Evan exhaled slowly, his anger cooling slightly. I'm not ready to forgive you, he said, his voice low. But, maybe I can give you a chance. Richard nodded, the smallest glimmer of hope lighting inside him. It wasn't a full reconciliation, but it was a start. After their tense confrontation, the relationship between Richard and Evan began to slowly shift. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of awkwardness, but Richard made a point to visit more frequently. Instead of grand gestures or trying to impress Evan with his wealth, Richard focused on simple things, like spending time together, talking, and working on small projects around the house. One afternoon, Evan mentioned the state of the old fence in the backyard. It had been falling apart for years, and the family hadn't had the time or money to fix it. Richard saw this as an opportunity not just to help, but to bond with Evan in a way that felt meaningful. Without making it into a big deal, he brought over his tools again, and they started working on the fence together. At first, Evan kept his distance, still unsure of Richard's intentions. But as they spent hours hammering nails and measuring wood, a quiet rhythm developed between them. Conversations began to flow more naturally, nothing too deep, but enough to slowly chip away at the walls between them. They talked about small things, cars, sports, and eventually, Evan's plans for the future. During one of their work sessions, Evan surprised Richard by opening up about his dream to study automotive engineering. He had always loved cars and wanted to make a career out of working with them. Richard listened intently, recognizing the passion in Evan's voice. It reminded him of how Jake had been passionate about certain things, though Richard hadn't always paid attention to them. "I think that's a great idea," Richard said, offering his encouragement. "If that's what you want to do, you should go for it." Evan glanced at him, unsure. "I don't need your money for school," he said quickly, as if cutting off any potential offer. Richard shook his head. "I'm not offering money, Evan. I'm offering support. I'll help you in any way I can, but I understand if you want to do this on your own." Evan was quiet for a moment, processing Richard's response. For the first time, it seemed like Richard wasn't trying to fix things with his wealth, but rather with his presence. That made all the difference to Evan. As the days went by, they continued to work on the fence and other small repairs around the house. It wasn't just about fixing the physical things anymore, it was about repairing the emotional damage that had been left in the wake of Jake's death. Little by little, Evan began to trust Richard, though there were still moments of hesitation. The process of building their relationship was slow, but it was steady. As the summer drew to a close, the fence was finally repaired, standing strong and sturdy in the backyard. It symbolized more than just a project completed, it represented the slow mending of the fractured bond between Richard and Evan. The time they spent together had chipped away at the distance that once separated them, and while their relationship was far from perfect, there was a new understanding between them. One afternoon, Richard watched as Evan packed his car with the last of his belongings. He was getting ready to leave for school, pursuing his dream of studying automotive engineering. The car he was driving was one they had worked on together, fixing it up during their weekends. It wasn't much, just an old, beat-up sedan, but the work they had done on it had given it new life, just like their relationship. Richard stood by the driveway, hands in his pockets, feeling an odd mix of pride and melancholy. He had missed out on so much of Jake's life, on so many opportunities to be the father Jake had needed. But with Evan, he had been given a second chance, a chance to do things differently, to be present in a way he hadn't been before. Evan closed the trunk and walked over to Richard. There was a brief moment of hesitation before he spoke. "Thanks for everything," Evan said quietly, his voice softer than Richard had heard it before. "I mean, for helping with the car, and the fence, and everything." Richard nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I'm proud of you, Evan," he said, his voice thick. "You're going to do great things. Just remember, if you ever need anything, anything at all, I'm here." Evan gave a small smile, the first real smile Richard had seen from him since they met. "I know," he said, and with that, he climbed into the car, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway. Richard stood there, watching the car disappear down the road. There was a quiet sense of peace in his heart, something he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the overwhelming grief that had consumed him after Jake's death, or the guilt that had haunted him when he realized how much he had missed. This was different. It was the warmth of knowing that, for once, he had done something right. As the sound of the engine faded into the distance, Richard turned and looked back at the house, at the fence they had built together. It wasn't just a project. It was the beginning of something new, a legacy not built on wealth or power, but on family, second chances, and the hope of a better future. Thank you for listening. See you in the next episode. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Goodbye.